There's a wide range of reactions that victims can have to being abused. Abuse is trauma, and for that reason, it would be natural that a trauma response would kick in. So let's look at the 4 trauma responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn. Trauma responses kick in when we're faced with threatening or distressing situations. They are also deeply ingrained survival mechanisms. I'm going to go through the 4 examples and give you 3 examples each of what a trauma response might look like. The fight response involves facing the threat head on. It's characterized by readiness to defend yourself and assert boundaries. So let's say that the abuser starts to belittle your achievements. The victim might become confrontational. They'll stand up for themselves. They might refuse to be diminished. They might respond with a verbal defense. Maybe they'll fire back with words and defend their achievements. Or they might set boundaries. They'll make it clear that those type of insults are not acceptable. The flight response entails the strong urge to escape or avoid the threat. You might physically leave the situation, you might emotionally detach, or just generally seek ways to distance yourself from the threat or the abuse. So let's say that the abuser becomes increasingly aggressive during an argument. The victim might physically retreat. They're overwhelmed and they just leave to avoid further escalation. They might even emotionally shut down, withdraw, and just refuse to engage further. Ultimately, they're trying to diffuse the situation. The victim might also engage in distraction. An example of that might be redirecting the conversation. Now let's get into the freeze response. This one is really characterized by immobilization. You might feel paralyzed, emotionally numb, or just otherwise unable to act. It's kind of like playing dead to avoid being harmed. So let's say that the abuser displays intense anger and intimidation. The victim might just go numb and shut down emotionally. They feel unable to process their feelings. Another is becoming physically frozen. You feel paralyzed and just unable to respond. They might disassociate and just become completely disconnected from the situation. It's almost as if they're observing it from a distance to help themselves cope with the intensity. Now, the last one is fawn, and this one I find really interesting. Fawning is a response where we try to basically appease or please the source of the threat to avoid further harm. This involves compliance and people-pleasing. We seek validation from the aggressor. So let's say the abuser is using emotional manipulation to gain control. The victim might outright comply with the abuser's wishes because they're trying to avoid conflict and harm. Ultimately, they're hoping to avoid more conflict. They might over-apologize and take the blame for what's happening when it's actually not their fault. Or they might seek validation even at the expense of their own needs. We need to be able to recognize our trauma responses as reactions to abuse, as survival mechanisms. Listen, blaming yourself, it's a waste of time. Our survival mechanisms exist to help us navigate danger. We need them. These responses are natural in the context of trauma and abuse. Recognizing them as trauma responses is the first step to regaining your control. You can learn more about trauma responses and letting go of that self-blame in the course called Reframing the Narrative, Liberating Yourself from Self-Blame.